Inheritance laws, I know. Not exactly like the most thrilling way to spend an afternoon, right?
Yeah.
But stick with us on this deep dive, okay? Because we're going deep on a fascinating part of this whole thing, a part that actually gets like really misinterpreted a lot. We're going into the Quran, specifically chapter 4, trying to get a handle on what it actually says about inheritance.
And you're in the right spot if what you want is clarity. We're not just skimming the surface here.
No,
We're going to unpack the details, the historical stuff, all of it. You might even have some aha moments along the way.
Exactly. We're talking chapter 4, often called Women, or Surah An-Nisa. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting. This chapter, it's way more than just inheritance rules.
Oh, absolutely. It's talking about marriage, about families, how you're supposed to treat orphans. It's giving you this whole ethical framework. And then inheritance is woven right into all that.
Yeah. It's like, imagine trying to figure out what a society believes just by looking at their laws. That's what we're kind of doing, and that's what makes this so fascinating. So where do we even begin to, untangle all this?
Let's start with something really basic to Islam. Inheritance isn't just some tradition they had. It's a right that comes from Allah.
A right, not a privilege. Okay, that's important. So if inheritance is this right, how does the Quran lay out who inherits what?
Well, the general rule you'll see is men inherit more than women. Usually a man gets double what a woman would get if they're in the same position.
Okay, hold on. I can already see people furrowing their eyebrows. Explain this. Why the difference?
Think about when and where this was written. The social structure, right? Men, they were the ones expected to earn the money, to provide for their families. They had to pay dowries. If they had sons who wanted to get married, they might even be taking care of their own parents as they got older.
So it's baked into the system, this idea of supporting the people who are shouldering most of the financial burden?
Exactly. Let me give you an example, okay? Say a man dies, he leaves a wife, 2 daughters, and his mom. His wife, based on verse 12 of chapter 4, she'd inherit 1/8 of what he had.
His daughter.
They'd split 2/3 of the inheritance.
And his mother.
She would get 1/6. The Quran is crazy specific. It lays out exactly how you calculate the shares based on who you're related to and whether you're male or female. All sorts of situations, passing away with kids, without kids, with a spouse, parents, siblings. It's all in chapter 4.
So like a divine spreadsheet, make sure everyone knows exactly what they should get.
Yeah, you got it. There's even a verse 176, that says, Allah makes things clear for you lest you err. Clarity's the point. They wanted to stop arguments before they started, to be fair to everyone, thinking about what society was like back then.
This is already really interesting, but I got to ask, if it's all about the math, where's the morality? I feel like that's got to be a huge part of this too.
Oh, you're definitely right. It's not just about who gets what. It's about how they handle what they get. That's where those ethics come in. That's all over chapter 4.
Yeah.
All over chapter 4, they're talking about what comes with inheriting the responsibility.
What do you mean? What kind of responsibility?
Well, one thing that's really clear is they cared about treating orphans right. Verse 2, it says, give orphans their property. Don't try to swap it out for something worthless. And don't take their stuff for yourself. That's a huge sin.
It's interesting when you think about it. We started with inheritance laws, right? But it's like we're getting this look into what they thought was important, what values they wanted that system to protect.
Exactly. And it's not just about being fair to orphans.
Yeah.
Chapter 4, it keeps saying, don't be extravagant. Use your inheritance wisely. It's not just about money. It's about ethics. It's all about social justice. That's a big part of Islam, taking care of the people who need it most.
This might be a good time to maybe clear something up. We were talking about how men inherit twice what women get and how they were the ones managing the family money, usually. Does that mean they were totally in charge of women's inheritance too? Did women have any say?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. People get that wrong all the time.
Right.
The Quran is super clear. Men might have been the ones holding on to the money, but it wasn't theirs to keep or anything. It was more about protecting it, making sure it was safe, especially since back then women couldn't always access financial stuff the same way.
So even with all that, women still had some control over their money.
For sure. The Quran, it literally says women get a share of what they earn. Plus, we're talking about chapter 4, right? Women, Surah An-Nisa. It's about way more than just inheritance.
So we've got a sense of how the shares work for each person, but what about how these inheritance rules connect to what the Quran says about marriage? That's a big theme in this chapter too.
You can't really separate them, can you? They go together.
So give us the rundown. What are the connections we need to see here?
Okay, so chapter 4, it talks about dowries, Yeah,
Yeah.
so everyone remembers that's the payment from the groom or his family to the bride when they get married.
Which back then was a huge deal, money-wise.
Huge. And then there are verses about how it's okay for men to have up to 4 wives, but only if they can treat them all equally.
I'm sure that raises some eyebrows today.
Totally understandable. But you got to think about the historical context, right? Back then, these rules, they were about setting up some kind of order, making families and finances more secure, and helping women who are in tough positions.
It's like all the pieces of a puzzle are coming together. Inheritance, marriage, how society worked back then. It all makes this big, complicated picture.
It is fascinating, isn't it, looking at these laws and seeing a whole different world, trying to figure out not just what they did, but why.
Yeah, it really is like looking through a window into a whole different world, right?
It really is. And, we talk about context a lot, right? And with these inheritance laws, the context, all that historical and social stuff, it's like the key.
This whole deep dive, it's been a wild ride, hasn't it? Started with what seemed like a simple question. Inheritance in the Quran, what's the deal? But man, look where we ended up.
It shows you how much depth there is to the text itself. We come in wanting these easy answers, but usually it just leads to more questions.
And maybe that's okay, right?
Maybe it is. If you take one thing away from all this, it's that these laws, these inheritance rules, they aren't simple. It wasn't just about splitting up money. It was about shaping a whole society, trying to meet people's needs, showing you what they valued.
Eye-opening is an understatement. So as we're wrapping up this whole exploration of inheritance in the Quran, what's the thing you really want our listeners to hold on to?
Good question. I thought my big takeaway is this. Whenever we're looking at these old texts, right, from different times, different cultures, we got to be thoughtful. We got to be critical, ask questions, try to see things from other angles, and be open to the fact that sometimes those old texts, they might challenge how we see the world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to say goodbye. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.